Hello, and welcome to today's conversation, AI and Chips, What the Future Holds for the U.S. and China. I'm Sachi Snellings, editor of live journalism and special projects at Protocol. Thank you for tuning in. At Protocol, we aim to arm you as decision makers in tech, business, and policy with the news and analysis you need to navigate a world in rapid change. Today, we will be joined by Protocol's senior AI and data reporter, Kate Kaye, and a lineup of experts to discuss the future of AI-related partnerships among tech businesses, developers, and AI researchers in the US and China. We have two exciting conversations planned for you over the next hour, and we're so glad you could join us. If you're not already subscribed, don't forget to sign up for Protocol Enterprise and Protocol's family of newsletters at protocol.com/newsletters. Now, without further ado, I'd like to bring up Kate Kaye, our moderator for today's panels, to introduce our speakers.
Hey, everybody, and thanks so much, Sachi. This week, Protocol launched an expansive series analyzing the much-hyped idea that the U.S. is in an AI race with China. Now, this really matters because the concept is driving U.S. AI policy, and it's informing lawmakers who will decide U.S. tech export controls, spending on AI research and development, and government procurement and use of AI. Today in our first panel, we'll talk about AI collaboration between the US and China, including in open source AI, how US companies with business in China are grappling with geopolitical tensions and trade restrictions, including blockades on advanced semiconductor tech, and about how one key industry where collaboration between the two countries greatly affects the future of health, food, and medicine. That's biotech. In our second panel, we're going to talk about AI regulations in the US and China, about how national security rhetoric is framing AI policy in the US and China, about how how that could actually prevent regulations and legal protections against harmful AI practices here. All right. Let's get into it and introduce the first panel. Hey, everybody. All right. Xiaomeng Lu is a director in Eurasia Group's geotechnology practice, where she focuses on policy issues such as data governance and privacy, big tech and antitrust, AI and digital trade, and evaluates the interactions of emerging technologies with geopolitics, market dynamics, and regulation. We also have Dr. Abigail Coplin. Abby is an assistant professor of sociology and science, technology, and society at Vassar College, and a fellow in the National Committee on U.S. China Relations Public Intellectuals Program. Abby's research analyzes the development of China's biotechnology and agro-biotechnology industries, which are very intertwined with AI, to understand how China's pursuit of high-tech development is restructuring relationships among Chinese society, industry, and the party state. And we have Davis Sawyer. Davis is a Canadian tech entrepreneur and a co-founder of Deep Light. It's a Montreal-based AI software startup that helps optimize deep neural networks. Davis is also the current chairperson for the Tiny ML Summit. It's a global nonprofit dedicated to ultra-low power machine learning. And speaking of biotech, prior to Deep Light, Davis developed statistical models for biotechnology. You guys have more in common than you knew. Okay. So Xiaomeng, I want to start with you. Among the U.S. companies and businesses in China you work with at Eurasia Group, can you give a quick overview of the types of technologies that those companies are involved in?
Yeah, thank you, Kate, for inviting me back to Protocol and joining this fascinating conversation. So at Eurasia Group, we work with a large number of U.S. companies that work with almost every layer of China's high-tech ecosystem, starting from the most basic, the foundational building blocks like semiconductor industry, whether they sell chips to China or provide equipment making tools that will facilitate the manufacturing of such building blocks of the industry. And then also some company are involved with the day-to-day hardware interface that both corporates and individuals deal with on a daily basis, whether that's servers and phones and laptops, you name it. And all the way to the most top layer, you could tell that you could say that this is the application layer. There are softwares, there are apps and services. A lot of U.S. tech companies are very much involved, exposed to all these elements I just mentioned.
Yeah, so right now, how would you describe the current state of tech partnerships between U.S. and Chinese partners in those areas that you just talked about?
I would say U.S. China tech partnerships is walking on very thin ice these days between China's push for tech self-reliance, the government in their 14th five-year plan, and again, more recently, the party's 20th Party Congress report mentioned that there's a drive in China to become more technology self-reliant. They encourage domestic players to focus on the critical, more foundational part of the tech ecosystem and encourage them to come up with replacement substitute for their Western peers and competitors. And at the same time, in the past 2 months, the U.S. put out a renewed effort and a call to maintain a large lead in critical technology sectors identified by Jake Sullivan in his speech in September. I think between these two types of pressures, a lot of the business ties I just mentioned that have been developed in the past 20, 30 years are under tremendous pressure.
So you kind of talked about this, but maybe you can dig into it a little bit more. How recent restrictions, specifically on advanced semiconductor technology, how those are affecting clients that you have that are operating in China?
Yeah, it definitely has a very strong impact on the market across the whole ecosystem. But maybe here I will just give a couple examples, particularly the ones that being impacted directly in the sector. Some of the companies I work with, China is a key market for them. And when their local employees heard the new technology restriction on the ground, some of them are told, you can't sell to that company, you can't sell that to company. That has a direct impact on the sales team. And some of the US citizens or green card holders working on the ground in this industry in China, they were told they have to stop doing whatever project they are working on. And in the near future, they will have to be relocated somewhere else, and their whole portfolio, their whole family life is going to change. That's a very, very direct impact on those individuals. Specifically. And I think for those companies, their local staff feel that's a moral shock. They don't know where the company's future really lies. And for themselves, they start to recalibrate what my possible career trajectory should be in this market or somewhere else. And this type of US action always have repercussion in the market. Even China hasn't put out an official retaliatory measure to date yet. It's likely they are thinking about that. And even the central government hasn't taken anything out officially. Some of the local government representative officials have taken the liberty to call actually some of the US companies operating in this market, because those companies recently launched a big plant in the US or have politicians coming to some of their important corporate events, and that generate quite a bit media buzz, which have been seen by some of the Chinese audience, and some local provincial officials even went further and took the call to those companies and saying, what are you guys doing in the US? Which side are you on? I'm mad at what you're doing. And to the extent some of them demand an apology for some of the US company operating in the space. I think that shows that's kind of an extreme example in terms of what are these companies are dealing with on the ground of China, but it's somewhat representative of the sentiment over there.
Right. So this sentiment seems to be there's a lot of negative sentiment brewing in both countries for sure, and that could be a whole other side set of questions to dig into what those companies are and what happened. But I want to go to Davis now, and I want to talk about, one of the things that the series that we've published here digs into is how important open source tech components are to building AI, and how important open source research is in the world of AI. Can you, from your perspective, you're focused on machine learning, you're doing a lot of neural network type stuff. Can you just talk about how important open source technology is, and when you hear about this AI race concept and all of these tensions that are happening between the two countries, like how does open source fit into all that? How does it, considering how important open source is, how can those things affect it?
Yes, so it's a very multifaceted question. So I think to start off, open source for AI and also software itself is fundamental. You can't imagine the world as it is today, whether it's banking, whether it's computer vision, without the contributions from open source. And so what's happened, from a timeline perspective, is in the earlier days, if you will, of the current deep learning revolution, 2015, 2016, there was a surge in frameworks, things that are called like TensorFlow from Google, for example, Torch, which is now PyTorch from Facebook, that are still used today, throughout every application. So I think, to drive the point home, you can't imagine it being done without open source, which is kind of interesting because this is free. It's very powerful technology that comes for free, and there's often a perception in the AI space, whether you're a vendor or whether you're a consumer, that software should be free. It's kind of an interesting tenet when you're playing in the ecosystem, trying to sell software, consume it, because of how powerful this has been, and it's set the tone. You simply can't imagine it being done. And this has been a global contribution, right? Where this, of course, has come from frameworks from Baidu, frameworks from Waymo, autonomous vehicles, etc., that are like I mentioned, on almost every device we're using and every device that we're communicating on. But what's interesting when you tie that into the race is that the scarce resource is not the open source software per se, but the people who know how to use it and apply it in meaningful ways. And so I think maybe the best translation of how the race appears to a company like ourselves and others is really the competition for the people that can apply these tools. That is something that's very expensive, that does have a price tag, and is, over the last few years, has been really a major part of either what we call in Canada, for example, the brain drain of excellent academics coming out of our institutions, University of Toronto, McGill, and then going abroad to apply those skills and make a living. That's really, I think, where the race becomes real for a lot of companies, both big and small. So the software might be free. For example, you can build a face detection demo for zero cost, but productizing that and deploying it and hiring someone who can use it, that has been expensive, and the race has made it even more expensive, which can be prohibitive, for a company looking to raise and develop solutions.
Yeah, and on that front, actually, one of the stories in the series that published today deals entirely with talent and academia in AI, and how some of the nationalistic rhetoric that's happening in the United States is, in some ways influencing Chinese researchers to consider moving away from the US. It's actually possibly having sort of a counteractive effect, as policymakers here really want to push. They want Chinese researchers to be here. They talk about it all the time, but in the same breath, they're saying negative things about AI built in China. So it is fostering this negative sentiment. So that's a story to look out for. But one thing, just really briefly, I'd love you to talk about is you mentioned in a conversation we had a while ago, deep compression, which was some research that came out of China that you said had a big influence on you and others in your area of practice. Can you talk briefly about that?
Yeah, happy to. So it did come out of China, and I think there was a university, and the first authors were Chinese, a gentleman named Dr. Song Han out of MIT, but actually was sponsored by American companies, NVIDIA and Stanford University. So again, these contributions tend to be, at the end of the day, very global. But
I think Tsinghua was part of it too, right?
That's correct. So to your question, just to get to the point, these kinds of works come out of academia. They're free. You can get the paper. They have results. But what's the contribution, I think, with this specific paper was that it opened up an entire industry. But by showing neural networks and AI have been historically compute very intensive and still are, and that's increasing. But this paper kind of inflected that trend and said, hey, what about deep learning or machine learning that's not compute intensive? And what are the possibilities that open up when we consider that fact? And after that paper, honestly, I think there's probably a paper every day now that comes on this topic or some extension of it. The positive of that is, of course, a company like ourselves, DeepLight, can be created, and many others in this space have been very, very successful. But I think the con of it is that it also limits the thinking space to that specific solution. The technique in that paper was a thing called pruning, and a lot of people considered, well, that's the only way to do this. That's the hallmark paper. And so I think that's something we try to counteract as practitioners. But to your question, it was a seminal work, to say the least, and opened up an entire industry.
Okay, Abby, let's go to you here. You follow collaborations between the U.S. and China. You've been on the ground doing your work over the years to watch how biotech researchers do their thing in China. And I know that there are some kind of biotech business partnerships that we've talked about in the past that are active right now. Can you name a few of those that you're watching between U.S. and China companies? You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I thought no worries. Yeah, absolutely. So when we're looking at collaborations between the U.S. and China, particularly not only in biotech, but particularly in this kind of AI, machine learning, data-driven, big data-driven analytics, they really run the gamut, actually, in terms of content. We have, for example, things that are about drug discovery and development, identifying new targets for therapeutics, genomic analyses, even some projects that are looking to better facilitate healthcare provision and healthcare access. They exist in both the commercial space and the academic space, and they actually also display a lot of diversity in terms of who's handling what kind of work, who is really, the AI powerhouse and who is working on other aspects of R&D. And so it's all about complementarity, both between the American and Chinese ecosystems and also between individual researchers and between individual firms. So just to name a couple that are different than the ones I originally named for you, Kate, actually just a couple of days ago on October 27th, we had a collaboration announced between XTelPi, which is actually an interesting company in and of itself. It started as kind of with some postdocs at MIT. So it started in the US, but now has its business operations primarily in China, and it's kind of identified as a Chinese company. They just signed on for a collaboration with Janssen, one of the Johnson & Johnson subsidiaries, that they are going to provide a number of small molecule hits for an identified target by Janssen. This past July, we had a major collaboration that was in silico medicine, another one of these companies that is actually hard to characterize in terms of whether it's American or Chinese.
Mm-hmm. They have two CEOs. They have a Chinese CEO and a US CEO. Yeah, exactly.
And so they had a collaboration with Tsinghua, Harvard, Hopkins Medicine, ALS Answer, like a whole number of University of Zurich, a big international collaboration that they just identified 28 new potential therapeutic targets for ALS. If we go more to the commercial side, there's been research that's using AI driven technologies to develop new kinds of therapeutics for COVID. There's also a really interesting collaboration between some ophthalmologists at University of Miami and a number of different Chinese academic institutions using machine learning to develop new AI technologies to screen for both chronic disease and specifically a variety of different eye diseases in rural areas where access is a major problem.
Yeah, and all those things that you just rattled off, it seems as though these kinds of partnerships, do you think that they're in jeopardy right now? Are companies reluctant to foster these kinds of partnerships in biotech?
Yeah, so we are definitely seeing an increased amount of, as geopolitical tensions have risen, both within the U.S. China relationship generally, and particularly around biotech. That has been one of the phenomenon that we've seen somewhat as a result of COVID. There is a lot of uncertainty on the ground, particularly in the commercial space, about where things are going to go in both countries. But there is still very much so a desire to have these collaborations. Moreover, I would say that there are definitely things that are lost if we, let these collaborations fall apart and let kind of this over securitization framework take over. One, as I hope you can see from the examples that I gave, on the whole, when we're talking about biotech, we're not talking about weapons. We are talking about curing cancer. We are talking about technologies that benefit humanity. Even on the ag side, we are talking about, creating new crops that are going to be able to help us combat climate change and combat global hunger. The other thing is that even from a strategic competition perspective, disengaging, decoupling, allowing these collaborations to fray actually can potentially hurt both countries. Biotech is really close to basic science, and it adheres to the cultural norms of basic science to some degree. To some extent, you stay competitive by staying engaged with your competitors, by keeping up on what exactly they're doing. There tends to be an policymakers right now are tending to assume too large a first mover advantage, that it's a zero-sum game, that if I get there first, no one else is going to be able to compete with me. That's actually not the case. In biotech, it's often the case that, your competitor beats you, at T.0, but at T1, you're able to beat them. And so staying engaged and keeping these collaborations going are actually a big part of maintaining the competitive edge in both countries.
Yeah,
Finally,
sorry.
Yeah, guys, throw one other point out there, which is like when we're talking about biotech, when we get into gene editing and these highly cutting edge and also highly controversial technologies, we are talking about things that are, changing potentially what it means to be human. These are technologies that even amongst competitors, we need to have open discourse, and we might not agree. It is not the case that we necessarily need consensus, but both countries are more secure when there's more conversation going on and we're more aware of what one another are, using these technologies for.
So, Xiaomeng, I want to bring it over to you. Obviously, there's still a lot of companies that are trying to maintain their partnerships, and they're trying to figure out, all right, well, how do I deal with this stuff? How do I prepare? If I'm a company with an AI team in China right now, for example, am I making do I have immediate changes that I've already made? What am I doing in terms of data related, data storage or data architectures, or I don't know. What kinds of things am I dealing with, or what kind of changes am I making right now?
Yeah, I think if your what you have in mind is the most recent U.S. export control rule, I think that type of rule has quite a bit sweeping impact on the industry, especially for U.S. company that has a major AI data center presence in China. If you are operating a data center and typically import some GPUs and TPUs to do maintenance or upgrade your processing power, after the US issued these new rules in early October, you will no longer be able to use some of those products produced by US suppliers. And even worse, if you are operating an advanced computing center or categorized by US regulator as a supercomputer, a large number of components and assemblies made by US and third-party countries will no longer be available to you if you comply with US rules. And I think the third way you potentially be impacted is that if you have partners, Chinese partners, they are doing research around computers and supercomputings and that type of capacity, and they happen to be on the the new list drew out by the Commerce Department as the entities focus on this type of capacity and potentially has a connection to Chinese military modernization effort, then you have to discontinue your partnership right away. I think that shows the scale of this round of technology restriction. That's a much bigger impact than, for example, the 2019-2020 Huawei restrictions.
Let's get back to something that you talked about earlier. You said there were companies, U.S. companies, or companies Chinese companies with U.S. partnerships who had people coming to their offices saying, "Whose side are you on?" What are some companies? What can you give me a quick example?
I think the example come from like a Chinese government official, particularly at the local and provincial level. They had a big reaction to the most recent U.S. Technology policies, ranging from the CHIP Act that gave the domestic player a general support to develop most cutting-edge manufacturing capacity for semiconductors. After the U.S. government opposing China's industry, the industrial policy in the same way for decades, they turned around and did their own thing. I think that generate quite a bit negative impact among the Chinese audience. And also the most recent round of technology restriction, I think cut off a lot of the business tie very, very directly between Chinese companies and US companies. And a lot of Chinese firms these days very much struggle with how do they go global? How do they even find a viable business model going forward? I think that's a particularly acute phenomenon in the AI industry, because for now, I think a lot of the early pioneers industry are really trying to grapple with a sustainable business model to bring in revenue, whether you are autonomous driving companies or you are the sense time Megabee type of like voice recognition, facial recognition companies. You need a business model to bring revenue. Otherwise, you are losing investors. You are losing market interest. Like what we saw recently, Argo AI is a company that has been a reputable player in the space and had a deep pocket backers like Ford and Volkswagen. And recently they shut their door because they couldn't find a sustainable revenue stream. I think that just add to the woe of this industry to begin with.
Davis, as somebody who runs an AI startup, you've told me that when it comes to chips, companies do not build for chips or other sorts of technology that are not widely adopted. How do you think global startups are thinking about or affected by these chip export controls and sanctions happening outside of the US? Like, as a global company, does it, even if you're not a US business, are you thinking about that?
Absolutely. Chips are the lifeblood of the modernity, and there's actually far fewer suppliers and fabricators than I think people realize. Really, there's just Samsung, TSMC out of Taiwan, and Intel is kind of struggling to keep up there. So and we're obviously a far small player in that ecosystem. But one very practical reality has been the design of AI accelerator chips that have kind of come for the most part in-house. That's been interesting to see Apple being at the forefront here, developing the M1 based on ARM technology, a UK company that NVIDIA tried to acquire. Google has been producing the TPU for years. And so what it means for a company that like ourselves, who could be building for commodity hardware, things that are in PCs, etc., we now have to consider how do we build for these specialized hardware, which we don't always have access to, and by design are often highly tailored to a specific application, which is a bit interesting in itself in that a single chip can actually be powering billions of things. I come back to ARM, and that ARM is a not as much of a household name as an Intel, but is actually in every single smartphone, and they kind of won that race with their IP designs, which are then licensed out to other companies. So, I mean, it might sound intuitive to say, but you try and and pick the winners. So we candidly do support ARM. That was a strategic choice we made for both the microcontrollers and the CPUs. But it's a very fluid situation, and I liked Abigail's point about the biotechnology case, where you need to stay close to your competitors. You need to see what they're doing, what they're creating, and even suppliers, because that will set the tone and set the trend for the end users as well. And interestingly, it's not just a race or a competition of raw performance anymore. With Moore's law and just the increasing of flops and operations, it's actually kind of been changed from generalists that get better to specialized processors. That's really been the future, especially in AI. And an interesting example would be Huawei's high silicon chips, where at one point, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we were definitely trying to think of how do we support high silicon, how do we look at their Kirin processors, and that's given the trade regulations and changes there, it's kind of been a moot point now, because we don't see as much access to that anymore, right? So we would have made a big investment for something that could have been obsolete, without us even catching headwinds of that. So it's a very fluid situation, honestly. But at the end of the day, what we're going to see for sure are more and more specialized processors in the marketplace.
And so, one of the effects, I guess, over the next couple of years that we could see, or sort of what I'm hearing from you, is that because of these major restrictions on chip sales outside by the U.S. government, that could actually have an effect down the road on how technologies are actually built, what they support. And so it's like, it's not just, I'm an AI development developer in China, and I can't train this model. It's like potentially has a domino effect beyond that.
100%. That's a good way to put it. And maybe one other component that is worth mentioning in this space, which is a bit of a tech jargon, but it's something called RISC-V. So this ARM chip I mentioned is built on RISC instruction set, and some of the creators of that from a couple of decades ago have now explored RISC-V, which is an open source hardware. And this is super cool and is still just starting to emerge, because I don't think we've seen anything like this before in the history of chips. For security reasons, for national defense reasons, a lot of this stuff is locked down and proprietary. RISC-V could upend that. It has the promise of lowering the cost of developing silicon. A more accessible, more affordable hardware is always exciting, but there's a lot of, like you said, domino questions of security and how to develop for these things that are really just starting to come to light.
Interesting that you bring up RISC-V. In the series, one of my stories deals very specifically with open source AI components, and the collaborations between US and China, and technologies that sort of cobble together components from US and China and, create these mashups. And one of those areas one of the things that I mentioned there is RISC-V. And, RISC-V has people and companies from the US and China and, other countries around the world working on it and supporting it. I think actually there's a NASA related project that RISC-V, the technology they're building, will be used in chips that are going to be built for a NASA project. So this stuff is, it's going on despite what we sort of hear in the news. These other things are happening under the behind the scenes, I guess. Maybe that can be a quick kind of end question here for everyone. I don't know, Davis, really quickly, is there more hype than there is reality in terms of this kind of decoupling question, mm-hmm. and this idea that we're all just in a big fight here?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. I think the Argo AI example is a good one, where hype up expectations are kind of in human nature, but the rubber meets the road, no pun intended, where if you can get revenue. So that's I think where that's going to be the scalpel here in terms of what lasts and what's not, is can people build meaningful businesses out of this? And the flip side of that is, RISC-V is open source. How do you regulate or control the export of technology that is fundamentally free and accessible? And that, what'll decide if RISC-V stays or not is if it's adopted, if people are using it, if people are buying it. So that's probably what the North Star I would follow.
Xiaomeng? Oh, you have to unmute.
I think can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think the whole hype around decoupling, maybe right now we're all talking about the negative side of it and what lesson we can learn from this. I think hopefully in the future, maybe in 5-10 years, the decision maker will realize that they overstepped on this one. They overregulated on this one. They drew the scope too far, and it comes with a high price tag in terms of reduced innovation and less benefit to the whole of society. And hopefully that will be potential long-term side effect that we will want to see from this whole decoupling phenomenon.
Abby, what do you think?
Yeah, I would say empirically, at least in biotech, we still are seeing a number of these transnational collaborations. We still have really dense in licensing kind of webs, company to company. We still have these born global companies. And perhaps most importantly, biotech is this field in which the interpersonal networks of those involved are very transnational, and actually nationality is kind of not really salient. These are people who all went to grad school together. They are people who go to the same international conferences. They're academics who exchange students, et cetera. Those kind of ties are very resilient to this kind of geopolitical discourse. That being said, we are seeing a distinct cooling effect. There's a lot of uncertainty. There is a lot of nervousness. And so while we have not necessarily seen a full decoupling in biotech yet, I think that if policymakers step too far, we are in danger of doing some pretty severe damage to the industry.
Okay, let's leave it there. Thank you, the three of you. That's been a great conversation. Really appreciate it. All right, well, maybe you can stay tuned and listen to our next panel, which I think we're going to jump right into here. Thanks again, everyone. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome. And all right, let's get moving here. So I'm going to introduce our three panelists. We have Rebecca Archesati. She's an analyst at the Mercator Institute for China Studies, known as MERIX. It's Europe's leading think tank on China. Her research focuses on China's technology and digital policy and regulation, including governance of data and AI, as well as Europe-China tech relations. And Rebecca has also researched Chinese exports of digital infrastructure and surveillance technologies. Renard Bridgewater is a New Orleans-based organizer, communication strategist, creative, and cultural advocate. Renard helped found the Eye on Surveillance Coalition. EOS aims to stop the local government's expansion of surveillance tools in New Orleans. The group worked to successfully pass a city ordinance banning facial recognition and several other surveillance technologies. Recently, city lawmakers in New Orleans, though, have already begun chipping away at that ordinance. Matt Sheehan, last but not least, is a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where his research focuses on China's AI ecosystem. He's the author of The Trans-Pacific Experiment, How China and California Collaborate and Compete for Our Future. Just a quick shout out for that book. I have to say, super compelling stories in there. So highly recommend The Trans-Pacific Experiment. All right. So, I just want to give a quick spiel before we jump in. A few weeks ago, a former Texas congressman, William McClellan Mac Thornberry, was a top Republican on the Armed Services Committee from 2015 to 2019 here in the U.S. Now he serves on the Pentagon's Emerging Tech Advisory Group, the Defense Innovation Board. He told a story. He said before the pandemic, he traveled around the U.S. speaking to business and community leaders, showing them photos of surveillance tech in China. I'm going to quote what he said. He said, I'd show pictures of the Chinese surveillance cameras and talk about their social credit system and how the government is using technologies to control its population. And they're exporting it to other countries. And so there's a real competition about what the future is going to look like between government control and not. Thornberry said this while he was speaking at an event held by the Special Competitive Studies Project. They're a non-governmental group. They're funded by Eric Schmidt, who was the former CEO of Google. Now he's a very avid tech investor, AI investor, and he basically bankrolls this group. And what they want to do is push for more US AI spending. Eric Schmidt is also pretty openly against any kind of AI regulation in the US. So, Thornberry was out saying this because he wanted to illustrate the ways local US economies are tied to the broader US defense and national security mission, which could be facilitated by AI and emergency technology use. So all these things are kind of intertwined. And the reason I bring it up is because it's kind of an on the ground example of this national security rhetoric that is really driving the conversation here in the United States around AI policy. This framing, there's this drive to push for billions more in government AI investment. But in the midst of all that, some people are really worried that this allows the United States to deflect scrutiny. There's a concern that some of these voices are, kind of pushing against regulation, that as we push and say, China's doing this bad stuff, we have to fight it. We can't be regulated because it will slow us down. That's kind of the rhetoric that we're hearing. So that's what I want to talk about today in our panel. Renard, I'm going to start with you. Tell me briefly about surveillance tech use in New Orleans. The city has recently rolled back an ordinance that you fought for that banned facial recognition use.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Kate, for having me. It's something that is constantly evolving. As you mentioned, it's certainly taking steps backwards, compared to the organizing work that my comrades and I did and accomplished back in 2020. As recent as July, as you mentioned, City Council passed legislation at our mayor's request to allow our police department to use facial recognition technology as well as cell site simulator tech to investigate specific criminal actions and crimes. We're also, currently in the midst of our 2023 budget season, where our police department is currently asking the city council for about $80 million of ARPA-related funds for additional recruitment, retainment, and I can certainly see that money or some of those monies going towards, the current surveillance apparatus in the city. And then lastly, I would say in regards to surveillance in New Orleans, a body that operates in the French Quarter called the French Quarter Management District, as recent as I believe is last month, if I'm not mistaken, they just got approval for a budget increase of about $700,000. And that's going to go towards automatic license plate readers. It's going to go towards more crime cameras, street lights, et cetera. And only about 7% or a little bit over 7% of that money is going to go towards houseless case managers. We're also seeing ultimately more and more money that's going into the surveillance apparatus, going towards policing, and less of that money obviously going towards the residents that need to see those funds the most, and having it work for them in a more productive fashion. I think it's also important to note there that the French Quarter, it's our beacon, right, from a tourism standpoint, from a cultural economy standpoint, but it also has the highest concentration of surveillance as well as law enforcement within the city of New Orleans.
And these are, when you say of surveillance, there's hundreds of surveillance cameras. A lot of them are in the French Quarter, but they're dispersed throughout the city. And a lot of them are networked into a real-time crime center that, they could be spun up and watched by police or, basically the people manning that center at any time. And now that data from that system could potentially be accessed in conjunction with facial recognition. So, AI is not inherent yet in everything in New Orleans, but it's license plate readers, access to facial recognition. This is a slow, gradual move into that. And so the reason I wanted you here today is because I really just wanted to ask somebody like you who deals with this stuff every day. You live in it. What do you think when you hear that story, like that story that I just talked about with, Mac Thornberry saying, I'm showing photos of Chinese surveillance to people around the United States? I mean, he could have been in New Orleans doing that and people would have been like, yeah, you don't have to show us photos.
Right. He definitely doesn't have to show us photos. And I think you bring up a good point because, he could have easily been in New Orleans, right? When back in 2012, Palantir, we were the home base, right? We were the test subjects more or less for the Palantir predictive policing technology that has been used in other municipal police departments across the country and other countries as well outside of the US. So I think, just listening to that story, it feels like a false equivalency for me. It also feels like vaguely hypocritical, right? Like if we're talking about China in one way and using that as a motivation of sorts to spend more money on AI here, when, metropolitan areas across across the country, right, predominantly Black and brown communities are negatively and directly impacted by that same technology or similar tech. So, just hearing that story and hearing the way that it's sold, it just feels that, our country is selling surveillance tech in a way that is certainly similar, right? It's an overlap for sure. And then just thinking as well, prior to jumping on about the way that, the Uyghur people of China are continuously surveilled in such a highly oppressive way. That can easily happen here, as you just mentioned, in a slow creep-like fashion, but certainly taking place nonetheless.
Yeah, and well, let's talk with Rebecca about that. So, the use of surveillance AI in China, particularly to monitor and surveil the Uyghur population, the Tibetan population, basically vulnerable, marginalized groups in China, is something that is definitely used here in the U.S. as a justification, sometimes for why we don't need regulation here. And so, Rebecca, I want to ask you about AI regulations and data privacy regulations in China that they do have, to juxtapose with the U.S., where we do not have a federal data privacy legislation. We don't have a comprehensive federal data privacy legislation. We do not have any real AI laws or regulations here. Can you talk about what's going on in China on that front?
Sure, and thanks so much, Kate, for having me on today. So I think the problem with many Western conversations around data and AI in China is that people sort of assume that China is this monolith where its authoritarian government somewhat doesn't have to deal with any policy trade-offs. And at the same time, it's very true that concerns voiced by Chinese citizens provided major impetus for governance of data and governance of AI in China for the past few years. I wrote about this in early 2021. Matt has written a lot about this as well. And there are very concrete examples if we look at some of the recent regulations that have come out of China. For example, China has moved to regulate the use of deep synthesis technology or deep fakes, which use generative adversarial networks to create fake or deceptive audio or video content. And while there are clear political motives for the Chinese government to want to sort of police or control how Chinese platforms deploy deepfakes, I think we need to remember in 2019, the incident, a public outcry in China over this face swapping app called Zao, which really caused an outrage online because people were really worried about identity theft. Identity theft in China on the Chinese internet is a big issue. It's a big problem. So part of what this regulation wants to do is exactly to address that issue.
Another example, which is more relevant to for the conversation around algorithmic explainability, which is also a big debate here where I sit in Europe, is the new rules on content recommendation algorithms. Now, these rules came into effect in March this year, and they try to address another thorny issue, which is the way that AI algorithms sort of push content to users based on their preferences, as well as other decisions which really affect society in profound ways. For example, how tech platforms organize scheduling and dispatching for gig workers, a social group which is heavily exploited in China. And so in terms of content recommendation, for example, the idea is to give users a chance to opt out of being profiled and being opt out of recommendation algorithms. But interestingly, when the Cyberspace Administration of China came out with this list of the algorithms that tech firms had submitted for review on this online filing system pursuant of the new rules, much English language coverage instead focused on how the government might try to use that to steal tech platforms' source code, so trade secrets. And I think that's simply not what those regulations are designed to do. And so I think we really need to understand how there are, these attempts in China to address very real privacy, consumer rights, and workers' rights concerns voiced by society. That's not the only motive, of course, while we're seeing so much AI regulation, and we can talk about that. But I think this is really important for a Western public opinion to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think there's another whole conversation to be had about the national security rhetoric around trade secrets, stealing tech. It's something that there's a lot of assumptions made about how that happens and whether it really happens as much as U.S. intelligence says it does. It seems like it's definitely a legitimate issue, but sometimes it gets hyped up a little bit. So Matt, let's talk a little more about what Rebecca just mentioned. You actually at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, you guys just reported on these recommendation algorithm regulations, and specifically in relation to gig workers, to food delivery drivers. Really interesting report that people should check out if they haven't read it. Talk a little bit about that, and why you think that, or maybe you can talk about how it actually sparked, how the food delivery drivers situation might have actually sparked those regulations.
Yeah, happy to. So, first off, in terms of like high level motivation or what I'm trying to attack with this piece, I think there's a very simplistic notion in the U.S. that, China, authoritarian state, Xi Jinping, all powerful at the top. So, all of China's policies just kind of spring straight from the mind of Xi Jinping. And we think that's very different from our society, where you have sort of bottom up actors, you have academics, you have activists, you have people like Renard, you have all these inputs into our government system, which then, maybe they get twisted around, but we see a lot of different sort of channels into how we make policy. And we see Chinese AI policy, AI regulatory policy as being this sort of purely top-down thing. And what I was trying to illustrate with that piece was the way that some aspects of AI regulation in China really do spring up from sort of social causes, social movements, and journalism in the country. So in this particular case, it started with over the last few years, delivery drivers or delivery apps in China have ramped up hugely. There's more than 6 million delivery drivers in China, usually on electric bikes and scooters. That's, I think, 3 times more than the US. And they're a very exploited work group. They're usually migrant workers, low education, they don't have health care, they don't have legal protections. And in 2020, there was a really big expose in one of China's national newspapers, not quite state-owned, not quite quote unquote independent, but a really good magazine article on this exploitation, and specifically the role that dispatching algorithms play in that, that the algorithms are basically, constantly optimizing for the fastest delivery times, the fastest routes, to the point that they put drivers in danger. They send them the wrong way down one-way streets. They give them unrealistic time frames. And it's just hugely psychologically taxing for these migrant workers, and it leads to death and injury. And so you had sort of this brewing sort of maybe social movement might be a little bit strong, but you had a lot of strikes by delivery workers in China. Gets reported into this big expose piece that went super viral within China, brought in Chinese academics like sociologists of labor, who in turn are quoting American sociologists of labor. And all of that fed into and eventually got basically written into the latest regulations on recommendation algorithms, where they basically say, you have to improve the treatment of the treatment of delivery drivers in the use of dispatching algorithms. And having talked to some of the people who work at the big Chinese delivery companies, they said that after that article, after this regulation, this was became a top engineering priority, that they had to essentially create more humane conditions for their workers. So it's kind of one example of one way that something ground up, something grassroots, and something actually trying to protect workers and people can sort of blossom within the Chinese regulatory framework. It's not to say that it's all good and these regulations are just to help workers. They're all happening within the bounds of what the Communist Party deems acceptable. And it's only when they happen to be sort of in line in some way with Communist Party priorities that they will really be able to blossom like that. But it's one way to see the kind of diversity of voices, both Chinese and then indirectly some American academics, international academics, can feed into how China makes regulatory policy.
And of course in the US we have AI-based systems for routing drivers who are gig workers. We have, there's all sorts of driver distraction technologies that are being integrated by the big OEMs, the big automakers around the world right now. Not to mention discriminatory AI systems used in hiring, banking, healthcare, policing. So what do you see in China's regulatory approach that US or other countries might learn from? Like, knowing that we have a lot of this sort of stuff here, how might that affect us?
I'll try to give a quick answer here so I can pass it back to Renard and Rebecca. I think that, we're clearly not going to sort of adopt Chinese values when it comes to privacy or surveillance of that. But in a lot of areas, these regulations are going to be deeply technical, like what Rebecca was talking about in terms of explainability. That's a deeply technical problem. It's a socio-technical problem, but you need the right tools and technology to even be able to explain how these algorithms work. When it comes to differential privacy or different things like that, there's going to be deeply technical tools and solutions that China is going to be developing. So that's one side. The other side would just be big picture structurally, how do we want to regulate the technology? The EU is taking a very horizontal approach. We're going to pass one big AI regulation that's going to cover everything. China's taking a very piecemeal approach to regulating specific applications of AI and kind of building up from there. I think we in the US can sort of watch how each of those develops and then learn from that and adapt it to our own circumstances.
Renard, what do you think about the fact that China has implemented some regulations? Should the US do something like this? Should we have regulations that are federal?
I certainly think, that's certainly been a brooding conversation for the last several years in regards to what takes place on a national scale in the country compared to it being something that's, as y'all have been discussing, in a piecemeal way across various cities and towns across the country. That conversation is certainly something that is starting to take place a bit more, which I'm, thankful to see. I think that in some form or fashion, like various policymakers from a municipal standpoint are almost looking towards our federal leaders to see if they're going to do something first to kind of set that precedent, right? Compared to it being something that they have to act on. So it's a weird, similarly to what Matt just mentioned, it's a chess move of sorts, right? There's a lot of strategy involved there to see what's actually going to take place. When something like this ultimately kind of requires a bit of audacity and a bit of courage to be able to say, like, we're planting our flag more or less, and this is what it's going to be for our city. So
Renard just cut out for me. Oh,
I could hear him.
you can hear me?
I think we've lost Kate. I'm not sure whether folks can hear me, but I guess the three of us could keep talking. Renard, you want to finish out what you were saying there, or pass it to Rebecca?
Yeah, I'm open to passing it to Rebecca from that point.
Unclear whether we're still live.
Everyone can hear me. Oh, Kate is, so maybe she wanted to pose the question herself. So I'll pause for a moment.
no, well, I did miss the tail end of what Renard said. You were saying something about audacity, and I was really intrigued, and then you cut out for me. So,
No worries. No, I was just saying, like, it requires, regardless if it's taking place, from a federal leadership standpoint, or if it's taking place from a municipal standpoint, our policymakers and our leaders have to have that audacity and take that first necessary and courageous step to say, this is going to be a safe harbor, similar to safe harbor legislation that has been passed, right? It has to also take place in that type of way, if that is the case, compared to sitting back, resting on their laurels, and then saying, okay, we're going to wait for this to play out on a national scale. You either do or you don't, because it has real life impacts for the folks that are directly impacted by that tech and by the AI associated with it.
well, I will say, as a longtime business reporter, that's how businesses operate. They wait until government says they have to do something, usually. And that's interesting because, Matt, you did talk about that, how the driver, the gig companies, they responded. Rebecca, why don't you chime in on this? I guess anything that you think is important to mention. We're sort of running down in our time here.
Yeah, so very briefly, I largely agree with what has been said. I think there's a lot to learn from approaches that are coming out of China. I think there's a tendency here where I sit, definitely in the EU, to think that Beijing, the central government, is the only actor in regulating AI in China, which is not true. It's a multi-stakeholder conversation, and where I think there's a lot to learn for European stakeholders, and probably also for US stakeholders, is, in Chinese AI research labs, companies doing pioneering research on privacy-preserving machine learning techniques, or AI safety research in autonomous driving scenarios, like that sort of stuff. And also Chinese academics, Chinese researchers. The Beijing Academy of AI is one example, an institution that's really working at the level of AI theory, working on brain-inspired AI and many other really important fields, collaborating very closely with research institutes across Europe. That's a space that I'm currently trying to study a bit more, sort of mapping out those collaborations. There's a great deal of collaboration. We tend to focus a lot on U.S. China research collaborations in AI, but when it comes to fundamental AI research, Europe and China are sort of two players in their own rights, and their relationship, I think, is really interesting. So I'm kind of concerned that, by focusing on the surveillance aspect, which, don't get me wrong, is an extremely worrisome issue that deserves policymakers' attention, we may be missing some of the opportunities arising from that collaboration. I mean, when I talk to policymakers in Europe about sort of AI policy and AI governance in China, there's often this notion of this, AI-driven social scoring. So we tend to conflate the social credit system, which is a totally different kind of beast, with AI, and that kind of becomes really, it's kind of entangled with a lot of assumptions that we make about China, about the Chinese system. So I think we should pay attention to how AI is used and weaponized in China against ethnic minorities, Uyghurs in particular, how certain political values and a certain idea of state security is definitely getting embedded into some of the AI systems coming out of China by design. Now, that's a real issue. But at the same time, you absolutely, and I agree with what was said on the previous panel, we shouldn't shut down collaboration, and we should make the most of those lessons that we can learn from China's approach.
So if I wanted to watch Europe and what they're doing in collaboration with China and some of those emerging areas, what countries would I be looking at?
I mean, definitely looking at the UK, that's probably China's #2 partner for AI-related publications. Germany is another very relevant partner for China. There are a number of research institutes here that do work with Chinese companies, with Chinese research institutes. There are Chinese companies such as Huawei and others that have sort of established their AI ecosystem across Europe, opened up new labs in Paris and London. So there's a great deal of collaboration going on.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you three talking about this stuff. I'm sorry it was such a short talk, but I feel like we really dug into some important things here. And the idea was really to, I think, talk about these issues in a way that is just not discussed enough through some different perspectives. So thanks again for joining. And please, everyone, check out Protocol's series, Are the US and China Really in an AI Race? Protocol.com. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.